Okay, I guess what we could do is start, and we might have some late people who start late. But
Sure.
thank you everyone for coming. So this is, I know this is the Parents and Caregivers as Partners virtual conference, and we may have some people popping in and out. So thank you so much for being part of today's session. Let me just make sure I can click forward. There we go. So this session is called Sharing a Journey of Indigenizing a Middle School. And we'll introduce ourselves and things shortly. So we're just going to be speaking about our journey as a middle school in TDSB, Queen Alexandra Middle School. So actually, let's start with our land acknowledgement. As with every school day, we have at schools, and as any meeting that we have in the board, we always start with a land acknowledgement, because I know sometimes parents are new to this practice. So this is something that we do every day. We acknowledge that we're hosted on the lands of the Mississaugas of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Wendat. We also recognize the enduring presence of all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. And then sometimes in schools, our land acknowledgement goes a little bit further and deeper, and we start to talk about things like pre-contact treaties as well, like the dish with one spoon, wampum, and other teachings, which we might touch on as part of the presentation in terms of some things that we do at the school. So what we'll do is we'll start off in introducing ourselves. So Ryan, do you want to introduce yourself first?
Oh, sure. My name is Ryan Nepen. I'm a member of Fox Lake Cree Nation. I'm the Indigenous Language and Culture teacher at Queen A. We are off to a great start this year. Very exciting times. We are actually making moccasins right now. So the kids are busy, and we're going to look at some of the work that we did last year as well to give you an idea.
Great. And I'm Mervi Salo. I am the principal at Queen Alexandra Middle School, and I have a mixed heritage, Finnish, Sami, Ojibwe First Nation, so very mixed heritage, but I also am very proud to be able to work with Ryan and support the great work he's doing with our self-identified students, and also we're doing work with the whole staff as well, and the whole school community, which we'll speak to a little bit later as we go through the presentation. This is just the online community norms. I think we all know them, just about muting your mic when the presenters are speaking, that kind of stuff. So our school is an inner city middle school. It's Queen Alexandra Middle School. So you can see on the sort of map on the left where it sits in terms of various communities within the city of Toronto. So you can see we're kind of in that Riverside, Leslieville, East Toronto, Chinatown area, just north of the Portlands. And then on the right, there's a picture of our school, and you can see the CN Tower off in the distance in the background, just to give you sort of context in terms of where we sit. And on the side of the school right now, we have these large black and white images of students and staff within the school, which was part of an art project done by our art teacher, Daniel Louis, with it's working with a French artist who was looking at the idea of photography as graffiti. And so they're on there with wheat paste. So they're there quite well. They've been up for a couple of years, but the intent is over time they will dissolve and wear away. But it's a nice snapshot of every student and staff member who was in the school in 1 year and one point in time. So it really brings the community face onto these big, tall, austere walls. So we're going to speak specifically about Ryan's program and some of the things he's been doing with a group of self-identified Indigenous students who work with him every morning, and some of the projects and things that we've been doing. And then I'll also speak to some of the things we've been doing with the whole staff and the whole school over the course of the presentation. And then at the end, if you have any questions, there'll be time for that as well. So Ryan, do you want to set the stage for the program?
Absolutely. You know, our self-identified Indigenous students, every single student has a very different relationship with their identity and also and background, right? So some of our students are very immersed in the and have a really great understanding of their Indigenous language and of the culture, are immersed not only in communities in Toronto, but, you know, ties to their traditional territories and communities as well. And others are coming to know. And so we are a varied bunch. But what this class and this program offer the students is an opportunity where we all can come together and co-learn together. Not only the language, we do focus on Anishinaabe-Moan, which is Ojibwe language, but also important parts of our culture. And some of that included beading and leather work. And so we had an opportunity to work with Indigenous Toronto artisans. And we did this in a very scaffolded way. I think the very first thing we began with was actually making medicine bags. And that leather work included, you know, sort of making these little bags that the students could wear out of deer hide. And from there, we started beading. So these skills that they learned for these two particular projects were the beginnings for much larger projects that are to come. In this way, everybody's learning while doing, but as so typical to the way in which we work relationally together, we're able to explore a lot of topics and issues as we're busy working. And sometimes that makes these conversations all the more rich, because when the students have something that they're creating while they're learning and discussing with the larger group, it's really rich knowledge that begins to produce, not only physically, but obviously what we're co-learning together as well. So here are a few examples. You can see the students' hands beginning to work on those deer hide medicine bags. The kids received teachings along with this from the artist about the medicines that we carry in these bags and what we use. We always start our class with a smudge, typically using sage. And the kids have received the teachings on the 4 sacred medicines: sage, cedar, tobacco, and sweetgrass. And it becomes the students' responsibility, and they're excited to do it. They come in and they start the smudge, and in this way we start in a good way. The kids know that when we're smudging, we're preparing our minds for doing good work, our ears and our eyes and our mouth, so that we're seeing, hearing, and speaking good words, not only to each other, but the work that we're about to undertake. And sometimes we smudge right down to our feet so that we're walking in a good way, right over our heart so that we're open to the work that we're doing, right? So, so the kids have aspects of all of those medicines that they carry in those bags once they're created. And many of those kids, it was very important for them to have this bag on them all the time. One, so that they're carrying the medicines and the teachings that they've now received. But the second thing is it then becomes an identifier of cultural pride. These kids want to showcase their work and also the meaning behind it. We moved from our medicine bags into beading. So you can see the medicine wheel there is a medallion that an example of a medallion that we created in the class. All the kids got to create their own medallions and beaded those as well. The last example is the example of the medicine bag that our teacher or our artisan created as an example, and that combines the two. It's a deer hide sewed medicine bag, and also there's some beading elements to it as well.
And it's really beautiful to walk into the space as the students are working, and it really feels, it doesn't feel like a typical classroom. Like, it feels much more like a space where we're sitting around a table in a circle and talking about life, talking about connections, talking about family. It almost feels like sitting around somebody's kitchen table and making and learning together through conversation and relationships. That's a really beautiful space to be in.
So we've mentioned, you know, it's varying journeys for our students to become self-identified, and sometimes to self-identify at school, and sometimes students decide to identify, and others are coming to that place where they feel comfortable to self-identify, right, as Indigenous. And so having a space that is sort of like a kitchen table where folks can come together and co-learn. It is also a place where students feel safe to begin to self-identify. And what we've noticed through the program is that students take that outside of the classroom. They begin to start sharing the things that they're learning and doing in the program in their mainstream classrooms, in their homeroom classrooms. And then, you know, feel comfortable enough in our school to begin to identify whatever nation that they come from, whether it be, you know, Anishinaabe, Mohawk, Cree, whatever. Yeah. The picture there is an example, was a picture of my grandmother's mukluks. We have they sit in our classroom, and you know, I guess it's me bringing in a little bit of my background and an ability to share with the kids where I come from, and who my original teacher was when it comes to beading and leatherwork. Yeah, I share that with all of you as well as the kids in the class.
Yeah, and I think it's a beautiful space because what your class is also a space where, as a students get to meet kids from different classes and different grades as a cohort for withdrawal. So sometimes students have expressed that they maybe in previous schools or in previous settings, they might have not known if there was anybody else in the school that was Indigenous, and maybe feeling isolated and alone, and here have a chance to build a sense of community. So I think that's a piece too that is beautiful about the program.
Yes, we got you.
So I know you these are a couple of pretty amazing images that you provided us, Ryan, from one of your trips, and it would be really great if you could maybe speak to that and how it ties to the discussion of colonial legacy.
Oh, sure. So these photos I have took in Indian Alley in Los Angeles. It's a very famous graffiti alley of graffiti art. These are two examples that I loved, but it's ever changing. Artists are constantly in there and updating the wall and changing it. But why I've attached this to an idea of a colonial legacy is, you know, our as indigenous people, we have we have a dark history related when it comes to education, certainly through the legacy of residential schools. And in many ways, our communities, our families, our students even are still healing from that. And so what's so important about our program is our ability to be able to come together and do some of that work together, and also understand where it is that we come from as Indigenous people, what we've experienced, and where we are now. And so this is the idea of survivance, but thrivance, right? We're thriving. We've survived these things through our generations, our families, and we are thriving. And that and honoring that is so important in our classroom. But it's a signal for us as educators as well to remember and understand where our families and communities come from and what they've experienced. Both of these images speak to the rich and varied experiences that we are currently living in, and the kinds of things that we produce. And I think it gives inspiration as well for the amazing work that our students are doing and continue to do.
I love that term thrivance, Ryan. That is so great. Takes survivance to the next step, because yeah, I think it really is a healing space for students, and as a place to celebrate.
Yes.
Right. And I think that really comes through in the examples. So yeah.
I think when I think about my role and responsibility, it's so tied to what I've mentioned. It's, you know, it's so important to be informed about our history, and that includes those dark chapters. It also means that we're bringing our traditional ways, our understandings through language, because language and our culture are so closely tied. So it means bringing that knowledge together, and what that sometimes means is bringing culture tied to the language into our class. So this is an example. You can see here that we've got bundles of sage and little braids of sweetgrass that were harvested. And so when we're teaching language, for example, when I'm teaching, I'm also teaching them where these words come from and what they mean. So for example, when we're talking about sage, it's a relational word. It isn't just sage that stands alone, but it's the role and responsibility that we have with that plant, which is embedded in the language. So we tease these knowledges out in our classroom. You know, there's a understanding that through our medicine wheel that everything is related and nothing can be siloed out and taught individually. And it's from this lens that we teach that I attempt to teach responsibly, because like I said, I'm teaching not only the language, the culture, but also our histories all together. And we could sort of see that as a braid of sweetgrass ourselves, really. All braided all together.
It's a beautiful image. Love that. You should incorporate that somehow into the room as well.
Yes.
So yeah, the ethics of relationality. I think I'm just thinking also not just about what you're doing in the program in terms of that relationality and going back here in terms of teacher roles and responsibilities, but just that idea of even beyond in the school beyond, helping the rest of the staff and the rest of the teachers in the school start to engage in that conversation of relationality, and then also not being afraid to be a co-learner and really looking at trying to encourage them to center Indigenous knowledge, and if that means reading a book together, by an Indigenous author, so that they're learn, so they don't have to come from, they shouldn't be coming from a place of the expert, as some people feel like a teacher should be, because that's not appropriate in terms of this kind of work. But to be coming in that relationship and be open to learning and being together and being open to all those discussions, and taking taking themselves out of that hierarchical space and more into a circle.
And so I guess when the ethics of relationality is also non-Indigenous settler teachers also understanding their role and responsibility in the classrooms when it comes to Indigenous education, and bringing those knowledges forward. You've said it so well in a model of co-learning. So, teachers aren't standing at the front of the room as the expert of Indigenous knowledge, but rather bringing in Indigenous voice, amazing Indigenous voiced resources, whether it be books, films, and then that the teachers, and this goes for me as well. Like, I'm Cree and have some Cree knowledge, but I'm no expert in Mohawk, Mi'kmaq, and other nations, right? So I wouldn't take that expert role, but instead I would bring those voices in through amazing resources, and I would co-learn along with my students. And I know that's what so many of our teachers are doing, and that's, as a staff, this is the role, an ethic of relationality that we're beginning to undertake throughout the school. There's lots of examples that we have to show you of that.
And we'll speak to some of those later when we get to those slides.
And that's the co-learning model that we're talking about. That is bringing Indigenous authored resources. And there are many. It doesn't end at films or written text. Even bringing in our artists is an example of co-learning. So when the artists, for example, come into the Indigenous Language and Culture program, I am co-learning along with my students from those artists, right? As is Principal Salo, who comes in and works with us as well. But those could be podcasts, that's music, right? There's so many different Indigenous authored resources that we can learn from. It doesn't always have to be an elder visiting us or a traditional knowledge person. There are many ways to bring in Indigenous first voice.
Mm-hmm. And I think another important piece is not only bringing in those resources, like we have a fairly good collection in our library of Indigenous authored resources, but then also building in the time for teachers to find out what's there. So one of the things we've been doing this year in our PLC meetings is having them in the library at the tables that are right beside that section of the library. And then as part of the work that we're doing and connections to the PLC topics that we're doing, we're also taking some time to actually pull books off the shelf and looking through them, because it's one thing to say, okay, why don't you take a look at what's in the library and how does that connect to what you're doing, to actually build in that time for people to do that, because it may be in there, I mean to do that, I intend to do that, when I have time I'll go down, but sometimes we're also busy, that doesn't happen. So building it into the structure and the weekly schedule or the timetable in some way, to even for that teacher opportunity to just realize the resources that are in the building.
Yeah.
So the early connections in the community in terms of the program were A couple of years ago, we had some students who were self-identified and didn't want to take French, and wanted a French exemption. And we didn't want to just have them, I don't know, sitting in a library for a period without any kind of a structured program. And one of the requests from them was they wanted to learn more about culture and language. And so we had a little bit of funding through Tanya Sank and Jim Spiropoulos to have a few sessions with bringing in a teacher. And at that time it was Billy Joe, and she came in and she worked with that group of kids. And they did we had some drums at the school that hadn't been feasted in a long time. So we feasted the drums. There was the teachings that went along with that. We had cultural instructor come from the Urban Indigenous Education there. Thunder Jack came in to help support that. And so these were kind of our early steps towards the program, where it wasn't really a program. It was trying to have that early connection in terms of setting something up to support the students, the student voice, the family voice, in terms of what they were saying they wanted to see when they were at school. And this is where we kind of began. And that was, I guess, 3 years ago now. And then now that built into something that is much more structured and daily for our group of, instead of it just being 9 sessions in a spring, it's something that the students participate in every morning, working with Ryan. And I know that he's been doing lots of really great work. Also, this is just an example of a banner that has a big presence in the hallway, just going up the stairs towards Ryan's room. And it was just speaking to the grandfather teachings, which I know he was doing with his students, but then also we were incorporating parts of that even into our monthly character education assemblies now we have virtual assemblies, but still assemblies in those kinds of places where we were trying to show people the connections between those kinds of lessons around moving forward in a good way, living together in a good way, living in relationship. Ryan, did you want to speak to the grandfather teachings, or should I go to the next slide?
Oh yeah, we can go to the next. That's other. So our language. So predominantly, as I mentioned, we're teaching Anishinaabe but there are elements of Cree and Mohawk that creep in. These are examples of students that have created positive messages in the language. So you can see things like "you can do it" or "thank you for sharing." You are, you rock, you're awesome, and good job. This was the first year that these pictures are from our first year of the program. Those students, I know those hands. Those were grade 6 students who are now our grade 8 students. And so, as I've said, our students come to us in grades 6, 7, and 8, and they have this ability to build on their learning each year. So I've mentioned that they come from varied backgrounds and entry points, but this is an excellent opportunity for us to come together and see the other Indigenous people in the room and learn together. And what that results in is an amazing community and capacity building. Even as I look at these pictures, I'm reflecting back. The growth in our students is amazing as well. These it almost brings a tear to my eye to consider that these young little fingers were grade 6 students, and they'll be leaving me at the end of this year at their journey going into high school. But they're prepared because as they move forward in their education journey, they're going to have an opportunity to take the language, to take Anishinaabe or another Indigenous language, and build on the learning that they've had at Queen A.
And one of the things I think that's beautiful about this is seeing those grade 8s really taking on a mentorship role with the students who are new to the school. And then I know you mentioned how when your older students had brought in their medicine bags to have replenish their medicines,
Yeah.
how the younger students immediately got excited by them, and they're, oh, are we going to make these too? And just so there were even that piece around the older students sharing what they had done in previous years, bringing out that excitement engagement with the younger students. So you didn't even need to be introducing that concept to them, Ryan. Like, it became something that we came from the students, and that hunger and that desire to learn and to make these things.
Absolutely. So as of the Indigenous Language and Culture program is a co-learning model where we all learn together, teacher included, from Indigenous knowledge and resources. The program really is co-constructed between myself and the students, and I think even Principal Salo mentioning that, this anticipation and excitement that comes from the students, it drives the program. It wasn't in my mind that the next step would be that we'd make these medicine bags, but when they said that, I've got to deliver. So that'll be next. And then what comes with that, like I've said, is that extension of knowledge of, okay, what are these medicines? What are they used for? And then bringing in that knowledge as well. It's all braided together, as I've said. Relationship is key. As we build our relationships with each other, that is when our knowledge and our knowledge sharing becomes all the richer. We start to feel safer. We see ourselves reflected in each other, and that's where that rich learning occurs. And so, I mean, if we're to continue with our braiding theme, I would braid these 3 sections together, and that's what creates our program. These are examples of student work from our first year as well. I asked the students to collect found natural items from our own backyard at Queen A and use those items to tell a story. That maple leaf is supposed to be, one maple leaf represents each of the students. Together it represents our class. I thought that was a really beautiful, these are things that the students are coming up by themselves, by the way. I thought that was really beautiful. I think the second one was a traveling story, if I remember correctly. And the third one is the story of Turtle Island. That was told by the students visually, right? And then so they use these visual cues to tell their story orally.
Yeah, I love these pieces. These are so beautiful. And then we also, I mean, we haven't been able to have in-person assemblies since the pandemic. So this is just pre-pandemic, but also having some assemblies where we included Indigenous performers or speakers, or in this case, this was a school-wide assembly because we have a number of students who identify at that intersection of Black and Indigenous. And so to have Kayla Weber, who Ryan knows, come in and share her story really helped a lot of our students see themselves reflected in Kayla's story. And I don't know if you want to add to that, Ryan.
And Kayla actually has been able to come in virtually too. Like last year, she visited us in a grade 8 homeroom and a grade 6 homeroom where our students were sort of divided. That's typically where they were coming from for the program. And Kayla tells her story of being a Afro-Indigenous and mixed race woman. She introduces the story, her story through a project that she does with, it's called Proclaiming Our Roots with Dr. Cian Wilson out of Waterloo. And it is digital stories of Black Indigenous folks across Ontario who talk about their stories. Many of our students in the program are also Black Indigenous, meaning that they have Black ancestry, and they have various Indigenous ancestries. So to see themselves reflected in the stories that Kayla shared, and seeing, you know, a similar story with Kayla was very important.
Mm-hmm. I just can remember how the students sort of rushed over to speak to her after her assembly, back when we were still able to do things like that. And just, you could see their hunger to just make connection to her.
Absolutely.
So we were, sorry. Yeah, I was just going to say, a lot of the work that we were able to do with the materials and the artisans came through the support of a grant called the Community Connected Experiential Learning Grant, which we applied for. The grant a lot of the grants were framed around the idea of supporting trades, and it was sort of a intermediate senior type of grant. But because being an Indigenous artisan does fall technically in terms of the trade definitions, we were able to frame our grant submission around the learning that the students could do around that. And it became a vehicle for us to be able to do, I think, a lot of things that we might have planned to do over a longer period of time if they had simply come from school budget. But we were able to do a lot more things in a shorter period of time in terms of purchasing materials and being able to support artists coming in and working with our students thanks to the grant. So I think that really did a good kickstart last year in terms of getting a lot of that foundational work done. I know you spoke to the beading already a little bit earlier. I don't know if you wanted to say anything else. I know here.
Two cool examples of what students came up with, because of course they designed them themselves. So a medicine wheel and a heart. That heart ended up getting filled out. That entire box outside of the heart got filled out. So some really cool designs from the students. These medallions became pins that students could wear.
And then we continued that learning into working with moose hide, deer hide, rabbit skin, and learning how to work with the artificial sinew and special needles that would work with the leathers, so I think there's lots of amazing, even just material knowledge that students, in terms of handling materials, that came from the experience. It's one thing to look at a pair of moccasins or look at a beaded pen and sort of understand that it's somebody made that, but to really appreciate the work, to really appreciate the time, to really appreciate the skill, I think the students really get that sense when they have a chance to work with them, and understanding that there's different kinds of needles, right? Like beading needles are different than sewing needles, and leather needles are different than fabric needles, and all of those kinds of things. And so there's that hands-on learning, there's the teachings that go along with it, and all of that together. And then the students, that pride you see when they maybe have never made something like this before, and they made it themselves. And some of them are so strong with the work that you can see that it's a real talent and a gift that maybe they didn't even realize they had until they'd had an opportunity to learn and make something.
Yeah. What I really see is that you know, that hard work paid off in the end, and the students get to walk around with these items. Like the moccasins that we're working on right now, the students are itching to be running around with their brand new moccasins that really they see as wearable art, right? Because these are the two hands that made the amazing moccasins, and they truly are amazing. They look absolutely beautiful, what the students are creating. And yeah, the pride doesn't always only live within the students. The teacher is very, very proud too. Here's an example.
Again, here are some more pictures. Yeah, I think we spoke earlier about the medicine bags, and here's some other pictures of that. And then also when we moved to remote learning, I mean, that was also a challenge, because how do you balance that, and how do you take something that's an experiential program and turn it into a remote and virtual space? So Hugh, I think you might need to press your mute. So how do we switch that to be in a virtual space? And so I know that the students were in the middle of a project when we switched to remote learning. And so Ryan went into the school one day and made arrangements for students to come by and pick up their kits so that they could continue that learning using Google Meet or Zoom in terms of that remote learning and being able to continue that. But it's been nice now that we have returned to in-person learning to be able to do that back together. But that's part of a challenge that I think every program has had in the last year or two in terms of how do we engage students in these very valuable experiential learning pieces when we have to follow protocols and we have to move to online learning and all of those sorts of things. And I know that this isn't just a challenge for our program, it's a challenge for every program, but I think you add these layers of how important that community building and experiential piece is to what we do, and how do we translate that to an online environment was particularly challenging. And then we also, even during that time when we had the virtual learning happening and the remote learning happening, there were workarounds in terms of bringing community voice into the classroom. And Ryan, did you want to speak to some of these people who shared some things with the school online?
Absolutely. So we have Angelique Belcourt and Christine Skura. There's Caleb Wesley and even one of our artists, Sophie Rostenpour, who all shared a summer solstice and National Indigenous Peoples Day message that became a video for the Queen A community that we sent out. This was during the time of the pandemic when we were from home. So I think, you know, getting a message from these community members was really nice, especially a way to end the school year. Angelique Belcourt did an additional knowledge transfer. She shared with us the teachings, a strawberry teaching, and some further summer solstice knowledge. They're all members of the Deepening Knowledge Project at OISE, an Indigenous Resurgence and Education Project. So was important for us to make a connection between Queen A and the work that was happening at OISE as well.
And then in terms of the broader school, there were lots of places where we beyond the program, where we were really trying to look at concepts of Indigenous education, and that showed up in many ways. We were lucky in terms of our school to also have had a couple of learning coaches that have been connected to our school who self-identify as Indigenous, and then also participating in various professional learning, not just for the staff in terms of the teaching staff, but also administrators, looking at how do we center Indigenous knowledge in terms of transforming our school. That also extended into teacher professional learning. Prior to the pandemic, we basically used to take most of our staff meetings, and they were really focused on some kind of a hands-on reading, learning together kind of focus, instead of it just being an informational time. And then now we are able to return to some of that with our return to our PLCs as well, which we've got built into our timetable, so that every grade team, homeroom teachers, has time built into their timetable where we come together to do some of that professional learning, to learn together. And I think, again, it ties back to that whole piece I mentioned earlier, where in order for us to move forward in this, we need to be able to build that time in, because it's so difficult. Our lives are so busy to do it unless we actually build it into the structure of our timetable together. Also having speakers who came in specifically for staff learning. So here's an example of Emily Blackmoon and Kathleen Longboat, who came in to talk to the staff around trauma-informed professional learning. And we released teachers to work and be in groups to be able to learn from Emily and Kathleen as well. Staff attended a number of UIC, Urban Indigenous Education Center workshops, such as book talks around Indigenous-centered literature, and various other professional offerings that were happening through the Urban Indigenous Education and their leadership within the TDSB around Indigenous education. And then we also took a look at a number of resources that the staff could access. So we've got, for example, these are just some examples of a couple of resources that are Indigenous authored textbooks, where teachers might be asking, where am I going to get that kind of textbook, that knowledge, if in terms of teaching my students, I don't know myself. And so having those resources within the school are ones that are really important. These ones are ones that were written by Pamela Rose Toulouse, who also took some of that knowledge and built them into actual lesson plans that the teachers could work through. So teachers may not feel that they are ready or have enough knowledge to build a lesson plan around certain concepts themselves. So being able to give them models of what that looks like as a starting point. And there's so much richness in these books that there's plenty of material there for them to start with. And they can use that as a framework or a structure, and then build in and make connections to their own long-range plans and learning as well in terms of these resources. I don't know if you wanted to say anything about the resources, Ryan, or should I keep going in terms of some of those pieces?
Well, only that I'll say that, these are, that every teacher has a copy of these, but also they're, with the resources that you just looked at, those two textbooks, there are class sets as well. So I know that those resources are being used. They're so important because these are also Indigenous authored resources, right? We're learning directly from Pamela Toulouse, and the textbooks are was an Indigenous writing team. So another way of threading in that Indigenous knowledge and content.
Mm-hmm. And then also having other, just having a range of resources. So when we're looking at treaties and looking at, treaty awareness, there are kits like this one that was one that can be purchased. We've got them in English and French because our school also has a French stream, an extended French stream. So that's something that's available in both of those languages. And then even prior to the program that Ryan is working on right now, he was a grade 7 homeroom teacher. And these are a couple of pictures from your class, Ryan, when you were a homeroom teacher, and just showing how I think it was beautiful because it modeled how we can incorporate uh, Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous education across the curriculum in a homeroom setting, that it doesn't need to be I mean, it's beautiful that we have this program for our self-identified students, but Indigenous education is for all. It's not just for our Indigenous students. And so this was a nice model of that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And then we've also, as we mentioned before, we've got a number of Indigenous authored texts and a range of resources within the library. And then also every staff member, last year I purchased a copy of Braiding Sweetgrass for every staff member. And this year I purchased a copy of Ensoling Our Schools. And so those two books are the center of some sort of book clubs that are going to be led by our PORs, our teachers who have a position of responsibility within the school. And I think that will be nice because we also wanted to make sure that some of that conversation that happens around those books, there's a lot of rich learning that can happen there. But I think having the staff learn together and not always having to be led by an Indigenous educator. I think sometimes modeling that those staff can co-learn, and it doesn't have to be, Ryan leading the book talk or Mary leading the book talk. Like there's so much that can be learned just through those conversations that happen teacher to teacher as well. Again, pre-pandemic, we also did a lot of lessons and learning around the Indigenous Peoples Atlas of Canada's giant floor map, which we borrowed from the Urban Indigenous Education Center. And this is an amazing map that has so many layers of lessons that can be done, because when you walk on this map, there's all sorts of information around languages and communities and that are built into the map that are not the way that many of us, when we went to school, saw maps of Canada. And so on the left, we see a picture of the map being shared with the broader community of Queen A. We traditionally have these school-wide inquiry projects where twice a year, every student in the school works with a group on a deep action-focused inquiry project, where it's not just a project with the way you imagine projects in the past where somebody would research something and then make a board and share their research, but the focus in the end was, what can I do? What can we do as a community? What are the action pieces that we can make in terms of moving forward? This particular inquiry was focused on the Truth and Reconciliation's calls to action. And every student was sort of taking a look at a call to action, learning a bit about what's the history that caused this to have to be a call. And then what are the actions that they could take, the school could take, the community could take to make this call to action, something that has been addressed. What would it look like if it was addressed? And so that was part of that learning. That was a school-wide learning. Every single student and staff member in the school was part of that TRC inquiry. And then a part of that was also the lessons that were done around the giant floor map. And then in the parent night, where the parents come in to hear and learn from their children and other children, we also had the map set up and some activities for the parents to do. So the parents were taking the paper cups and placing them on the part of the map where they had some kind of personal connections to. And Ryan, did you want to add anything in terms of either the inquiry or the map piece?
Yeah, the other thing about the map is that it's bordered in a timeline of the residential school system too. So you can follow this map and see the timeline history. That's an interesting thing as well. We also did a build a community exercise, a simulation as well with the students that year using the map. So students could have an immersive experience of this history as well.
And here's a picture, again, pre-pandemic, of what it looks like in terms of the students did also create either digital or physical representations of their learning, and then were prepared to speak to what they were saying, what was the action that needed to happen. And what was really beautiful, and hopefully we'll be able to return to this soon, was prior to this night and prior to the completion of these projects, every student group would have a fireside chat with either myself or my vice principal. And so it was a chance for them to share and what they were learning about, what their conclusions were with my vice principal and myself. And we had a chance to meet every student in the school and hear about what they were learning, and gave them a chance to practice articulating what they were going to articulate on the parent night to somebody who was outside their classroom. Obviously, that's not something we can do right now with the protocols in place for the pandemic, but I think it's something that we aspire to return to once we're allowed to.
Absolutely.
We also had some other, these are just some other examples of things that we've done at the school. We were hosting one of the large board events for Day of Pink. And in preparation for that, there were a number of students who were preparing dance, drama, music performances. And so this group is our GSA, and the GSA worked with Malika Wary, who helped them take their message, their already very powerful message, and turn it into amazing spoken word piece that they then performed for a broad audience, not just the school. We had various invited guests who came on that day, and they were able to convey their very powerful message to that audience. We also had all sorts of other pieces that were connected to this. We had an opening with Aqua, who did a song at the beginning. We had all sorts of things that were part of it. Every student wrote a message of something that they stood up for, or they believed, or that they promised to the world, and wrote it on a card. And we took pictures of every student in the school, and we had this huge wall of all of these promises and beliefs that the students in Queen A represented. And then we had somebody, Mike Izzo from the Urban Indigenous Education Center, came to help us with our Two-Spirit Pride flag raising. And so this fall, I guess the examples we're showing here is that this isn't just something that was happening in a classroom here or a classroom there, but it was something that was being incorporated into a whole range of even school-wide activities. We hosted hot docs for schools. series of videos, and the students had different documentaries that they were able to see. So it was like a mini film festival, and the students were able to choose different films that they were going to be watching. And so these are examples of students, going into, in this case, was our lunchroom, which we haven't really been using for lunch for a couple of years, but to watch films, and we had them set up in different spaces. So we had a film screening space in the library, in the lunchroom, in the gym, and so we had this mini film festival, which was connected to the learning of the whole school as well. And again, at this, we want to also include a couple of other slides around some more resources. There's tons of resources out there if you are looking for resources. I mean, a great source is Good Minds, which I think we have a slide for. If you just Google Good Minds, and you can, if it's something that you are, as a parent, interested in trying to find some books for yourself and your family, that's a good place to start. Ryan, did you want to speak at all to these, or into the Deepening Knowledge Project maybe?
Oh, sure. Yeah, Deepening Knowledge Project is another great resource for, typically teachers use this, but I think, anyone that wants to deepen their knowledge when it comes to Indigenous content, these are a great place to start. I'll tell you the logo, which is the tops of moccasins are called vamps, on that clay colored circle, was actually done by one of our artists who taught our students. On the left vamp, we're supposed to be standing on the shoreline looking into the water, illuminated by grandmother moon. And on the right vamp, its turtle has just plunged in, jumped off the island, the grandfather rocks, into deeper waters, also illuminated by the 7 grandfather teachings, into deeper waters where we know our memories and our knowledge lives. And so thus the Deepening Knowledge Project. I thought that was really beautiful. Sophie was the beading teacher for our students, and beaded these moccasins for the project. So, she shared with us so much of her projects, and the students really loved that. But yeah, that website is a place for deeper learning as well.
And then we hope that this is just not only a beginning of what we're doing at our school, but we hope to be working with some other schools in the neighborhood that have also indicated an interest in deepening their knowledge around Indigenous education in partnership with the Urban Indigenous Education Center. So we hope that this project will continue and expand to other schools and build relationships between teachers and administration across schools in the neighborhood. So we hope to be able to continue that knowledge in a broader way, even beyond our school. Now we are at exactly 1 hour. I think our presentation is supposed to be 1 hour, and I don't know if you are all rushing off to other presentations, but if you are not, we're open to also any questions and answers. And if you are rushing off to another presentation, thank you for participating and listening to our story. It's one story of one school and one journey in terms of how we are trying to work together to build something. But again, continue your learning and find out and connect with other places and spaces that are also doing this journey. And it may look different than what we're doing. But as I said, it's one journey. And thank you so much, Miigwech. So Hugh, I think your hand is up. Do you want to unmute and ask?
Yep. What I was kind of looking at is I love that book that you recommended, Braden Sweetgrass. And I know this year at the CSW I am with TDSB, a big part of focus for us is literacy with parents. So I know, like, within the book of Braiding Sweetgrass, there is so much rich knowledge about Indigenous truths and way of living. If there is a way to actually if there's a suggestion on a way to engage parents in even from a book reading club, but into have like is how would I be able to get connection to someone that would be able to, even in the process of reading a book like that, to get parents maybe out in the green spaces within Toronto or on the externals to experience the journey of that book. You know what I mean?
Well, I think the example that we gave in terms of our reading of that book and the book club that we'll be running is that you don't need to bring anybody special in from outside. It can be a journey where the parents and yourself or whoever is part of that club can read sections of the book and then share their learnings, their aha moments, their realizations of a different perspective that they maybe weren't aware of. And so, you know, it can be something that you even do virtually if you find that there isn't a way to meet in person. You can just have times where you do a Zoom meet like this and say, let's speak about X section of the book. And it doesn't need to necessarily have, like if you don't have anybody already in your community who, you don't need to have somebody taking on a leadership role of that. It can be much more of a collaborative, relational kind of thing. Or if you want to find a, you know, it's getting a bit cold now. We're moving into the winter months, but you know, in our school, last year we put out we had a circle of benches that was installed in the backyard, which becomes a space that people can wooden benches. And if you are part of the TDSB, you can connect with the sustainability department, I think it was. And because those benches came from a partnership between the TDSB and the City of Toronto. So as the City of Toronto has to cut down trees for reasons like the emerald ash borer on the ash trees, they have these huge trees and logs, and rather than them just being shredded, they're being cut in half, and TDSB carpenters are turning them into benches, and we were able to get a circle of benches through that project. So it could be something that's easily installed in the yard of the school as a space where you can meet outdoors. I don't know if that is answering your question.
It's definitely giving me some direction. Thank you.
Any other questions?
I see one in the chat. Maybe I'll read it. I know it's hard when you're presenting. It says, I am a new member of a middle school council, and I am wondering how you worked with parents in the council or not as part of the relationship building and the funding of Indigenous learning in the classroom, like bringing in the artists. So I think you were a little bit late. Principal Salo talked about that this was a grant that was applied for. I don't know.
So yeah, in terms of the funding, you know, obviously some of it does have to come from school budget, of course, but we were able to do more in a shorter amount of time because we applied for a community experiential learning grant that helped fund a lot of the materials and things like that for the examples we had in the presentation. In terms of parent council, we have a fairly small parent council, and they definitely are very supportive of the work of the school. They have supported the school, not particularly this project. They've been supporting things like the purchasing of some instruments, some of our grad components, those sorts of things. But having said that, they also recognize their need to learn as part of the journey of reconciliation. And in their last pro grant, they did apply for some funding to be able to have an Indigenous speaker who will be speaking to doing a parent event that will also be speaking to parents, and parents will be invited as well. So I don't know if that answers your question.
her mic was not working, so
Okay.
maybe she's not able to
Can
reply.
you get a
I
look
guess
at
the
that?
last part, it says not exclusively funding, and love to hear of non-funding engagement from parent council.
If I could add to that, she could reach out to her community support worker if there is one in her school, because a part of their main responsibility and focus is parent engagement, and they would be able to work alongside her in trying to do that.
You might want to just check with you said there isn't one. You might want to check with your principal, because there are community support workers that are assigned to a number of schools, and often they will, they'll focus their attention on where their requests are coming from. So maybe just speak to your principal and find out if there is a community support person who hasn't necessarily connected to the school that often. And by engaging with them, contacting them, it might be an opportunity for them to build a relationship with your parent council and your school community.
Mhm, mhm.
And then in terms of other ways, I mean, also engaging the parents in participating in things like this. I think this, like coming to something like this, and or even if you go back and share with your parent council some of what you learned today in the different sessions, it can become, you can become a catalyst of change and learning and those sorts of things. And then just to start that conversation and say, hey, these are some of the things that I heard about on Saturday that are happening in these different schools. And maybe that's something we should be looking at, and maybe even reach out parent council to parent council across different schools and say, even in your neighborhood, and say, hey, we want to look at reconciliation initiatives. We want to look at Indigenous learning. We want to support our schools. Are you doing something? Is it something that we can do together? So you don't have to invent the wheel yourself, because I know that there's other schools that are also doing this work that may not realize that their neighboring schools also interested in this work. And I think it would be amazing to mobilize the parents in terms of that. And maybe having your principal reach out to the principals in Ward 15 and ask who are the parent council chairs in the other schools in Ward 15, and then just even start an email to that whole group and say, hey, can we meet together even on Zoom and talk about possibilities and ideas?
Mhm.
I don't know if there's any other questions.
No questions, but I'm actually a teacher and a learning coach. I just started as a learning coach with the board, but I'm a parent, and so thank you for all the beautiful work that you do. And I know it's one journey, but it's such an important journey for the students that you have there and the community. But I'd be so fortunate. I don't self-identify as an Indigenous member, and I mean, we're from a Chinese background actually, but I feel like if my kids had a community and a space and educators like you teaching them, they would be so fortunate. So so thank you very much for your presentation. It was really quite wonderful. I was supposed to be in another one, and then I saw this one and I jumped in, and I was like, oh, I'm so glad I did.
Oh, well,
So thank you for all your
thank you for your
Don't
kind
tell the
words,
other group.
Lucy. And well, we're so happy that you stayed then.
Yeah, thank you. I've seen your space before. My children actually go to Queen A for Chinese school because they
Oh,
run out of your school. And I've always walked around and thought, what a beautiful space. So, but thank you so much.
oh, thank you. Thank you. Oh, so you are in the neighborhood, and or not.
Not really. Yeah, I
Okay.
drive down to the neighborhood. And that, like the photos outside of the building, I've always been so attracted to too. So thank you for talking a little bit about that, because I've always wondered. So, but
Yeah.
thank you, Ryan and Mervi.
Thank you, Lucy.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay. And I don't know if we have any other questions. And if not, thank you for being part of the session and have a wonderful day. Enjoy your weekend.